Today, inshallah, we are going to complete Chapter 6, which is the money supply and the Federal Reserve System. In the last class, we discussed some concepts and terms related to the money supply and the barter system, which was created, or the interaction between, or the purchasing and selling of different goods and services was, or were deal by using the barter system, نظام المقايضة. And after that, the idea or the concept of money has been created to solve the different problems that face the barter system, right? Today, inshallah, we are going to complete the money supply, and we have we are going to focus on two main ideas. Number one, the main tools that the government or the central bank or the Federal Reserve System use to create money or to control the money supply, and how to calculate the money multiplier and the money supply. Okay? The central bank or the Federal Reserve System uses three main tools to control the money supply. These tools are the required reserve ratio. نسبة الاحتياط القانوني. Suppose that someone of you has $100 and he would like to deposit it at the Bank of Palestine, right? Suppose that you have $100 and you would like to put it as a deposit in the Bank of Palestine. In this case, the Bank of Palestine must deduct or cut part of this amount and deposit it in the central bank. The value of the deducted money is called the required reserve. هلا الجزء هذا اللي بدنا نقصه من $100 ونحطه في سلطة النقد أو في البنك المركزي اسمه required reserve. In order to protect the deposits for the depositors, عشان نحمي اللي هم الإيداعات أو الودائع تبعت الناس اللي بيحطوا مصاريهم في البنوك. تمام؟ طيب, so suppose that the required reserve ratio is نسبة الاحتياط القانوني equals 20%. This means that the Bank of Palestine must deduct 20% out of this deposit. This is a deposit. It's called a deposit, which equals $100, right? In this case, the Bank of Palestine must deduct or cut 20% of $100 and deposit it at the central bank or the Palestinian Monetary Authority. So in this case, the required reserve equals required reserve ratio times deposit. Right? So the required reserves equals, how much is the required reserve ratio? 20% times $100, so which equals $20. So in this case, the required reserve equals, هذا اللي هو الاحتياط المطلوب ينحط في سلطة النقد, equals $20. In this case, we have excess reserve by how much? $80. في عندنا احتياطي فاضي بنقدر نتصرف فيه. صح? So in this case, the excess reserves equals the actual reserve minus the required reserve, or the total reserves minus the required reserve, which equals 100 minus 20 equals how much? Exactly. The bank can lend $80, right? So in this case, the Bank of Palestine is not able to lend the total deposit, because it has to deduct 20% out of this deposit and deposit it where? At the bank or the central bank or the Federal Reserve System or the Palestinian Monetary Authority, as you know, in the Palestine. Right? Okay? Tamam? طيب. This is the main tool, or one of three tools that the central bank or the Federal Reserve System can use in order to control the money supply. Now suppose that the central bank decided to increase the required reserve ratio. What should happen to the money supply? And suppose that the required reserve ratio increased from 20% to 40%. This leads to what? Decrease the excess reserve that the bank can lend for the public or the popular. صح? Exactly. So in this case, the money supply would what? Increase or decrease? Exactly. The money supply would decline. صح ولا لا؟ لأنه المسار عمليا صار البنك اللي قادر يقرضهم بنك فلسطين للناس قل، وبالتالي المونey supply would decline. صح ولا لا؟ So we have an inverse relationship between the required reserve ratio and money supply. صح؟ Exactly. هلا شو هذا معناه؟ إنه لو راح البنك أو السنترال بانك أو الفيدرال ريزيرف سيستم قال لك إنه أنا required reserve ratio بدل ما هو 20 بدنا نقص 40 ونخليهم عند السنترال بانك. عمليا ببطل البنوك معها مصاري او حجم الودائع الموجوده عند البنوك بتقدر تتصرف فيها بتقل، وبالتالي الموني سبلاي would decline. Right? So there is an inverse relationship between the required reserve ratio and the money supply. Right? So this leads to, or we have the final result or theory as there is an inverse relationship between the required reserve ratio and the money supply. So the increasing of required reserve ratio leads to a decreasing in money supply. Right? Okay? فاهمين اللوجيك؟ تمام؟ طيب. The second tool that the central bank or the Federal Reserve System can use is the discount rate. The discount rate. أمسح هذا؟ Okay. Okay. So the second tool that the central bank or the Federal Reserve System can use is the discount rate. The discount rate. The discount rate is quite similar to the interest rate. But let me ask a question for you. Suppose that you need money and you went to the bank of the Arab bank, right? And you would like to withdraw a loan or to take a loan from this bank. You have to pay interest, right? So as a client, if you went to the commercial bank to withdraw a loan, in this case you have to pay what? You have to pay interest. It's called the interest rate, right? But suppose that the commercial bank needs money and suppose that he has a bankruptcy, عنده إفلاس. If he needs money, or if the bank needs money, or the commercial bank needs some money, he might go to the central bank to withdraw a loan. هلا كمان البنك التجاري بيروح بيقترض من مين؟ من سلطة النقد أو من البنك المركزي. In this case, they have to pay a discount. It's called, or the cost of borrowing. تكلفة الاقتراض هذه من البنك التجاري from the central bank is called the discount rate. لأنهم بيدفعوا interest كمان. صح؟ هلا السنترال بانك بعطولوش الفلوس هيك. So we have what? A discount rate. The cost of borrowing for the commercial banks from the central bank or the Federal Reserve System is called the discount rate. سعر خصم. تمام؟ So suppose that, or my question is, what is the relationship between the discount rate and the money supply? If the discount rate increase. This leads to a decreasing of money supply. يعني suppose انه البنك المركزي قال لك والله انا بدي اخذ على السحوبات تبعتك كبنك تجاري، اذا بدي اخذ بدل ما اخذ 30% بدي اخذ 70%. تمام؟ ببطل البنوك التجاريه تقترض منهم، مظبوط ولا لا؟ وبالتالي الماني سبلاي would decline. مظبوط ولا لا؟ لانه الماني سبلاي هو جزء منه غير الموجود في الكوميرشال بانكس. صح شباب؟ So there is an inverse relationship between the discount rate and money supply. So, yes. Okay. The discount rate, as I mentioned, is the cost of borrowing of the commercial banks from the central bank, right? Suppose that the commercial bank needs money, and he went to the central bank and received a loan. He has to pay, or it has to pay, what? Interest. This interest is called the discount rate. Suppose that the central bank decided to increase the discount rate. بيقول لهم انه انا سعر الاقتراض تبعي عالي، بديش اخليه 20%، بدي اخليه 60% وبدي اخليه 50%. In this case, what would happen? The money supply, which is available at the commercial banks to be lending, in this case, what would happen? Would decline. So the money supply in general would decline. صح شباب؟ مظبوط ولا لا؟ طيب. The last point, so we have an inverse relationship between the discount rate and the money supply. صح؟ So in general, there is an inverse relationship between the required reserve ratio, and money supply, as well as an inverse relationship between the discount rate and the money supply. هي القاعدة تبعتنا. في inverse relationship between the required reserve ratio and the money supply, as well as an inverse relationship between the discount rate and money supply. What about the last point, which is, or the last tool that the central bank can use or uses in order to control the money supply? The last point is the open market operations. So this is the second tool. The third tool is the open market operations. Under this policy, the central bank can sell securities and buy securities or bonds. عادي لو انه بده suppose that the central bank would like to increase the money supply، بده يزود عرض النقد في دين الناس، ايش بيسوي؟ بيشتري ورق وبعطيهم مصاري. صح؟ بيشتري securities وبونز وهيك وبعطيهم مصاري. So in this case, the central bank, if the central bank would like to increase the money supply، بده يزود المصاري في دين الناس، ايش بيعمل؟ بيشتري منهم الورق اللي موجوده معهم. So in this case, it can purchase or buy securities or bonds and so صح؟ And if the banks or the central bank would like to decrease the money supply، بده يسحب المصاري من دين الناس، ايش ببيع؟ بعطيهم ورق وباخذ مصاري. So in this case, it can what? Sell securities or bonds, treasury bonds and notes. تمام؟ صعبة؟ بس يعني بعطيه ببيعهم ورق وباخذ منهم الفلوس، وبالتالي in this case the money supply would decline, right? Now let's go to different applications or exercises related to the excess reserves and required reserves, and different issues related to the money supply. And so as you see, the reserves means the total reserves are what? The deposit that the bank has at the Federal Reserve Bank plus it cashed on hand. The required reserve ratio اللي هو هذا اللي نسبة الاحتياط القانوني, what is it? Is the percentage of its total deposits that the banks must keep as a reserves at the Federal Reserve System اللي وضحناه. تمام؟ طيب. The excess reserves are or equals the actual reserves or that minus the required reserve. صح? So as we mentioned, that suppose that you deposit $100 at the Bank of Palestine, you have, or the bank in this case must deduct part of this amount, which about the value of the required reserve ratio, and deposit at the central bank. صح؟ هذا this is the required reserves. طيب. Suppose let's go to this example or the exercise. As you see, if the required reserve ratio is 20%, the bank has excess reserves of what? $80. With $80 excess reserves, in this case, the deposit قديش؟ $100. Suppose that the deposit equals $100. So as you see, we have a deposit of $100, reserves equals $100, right? Now suppose we have a deposit of $500, right? In this case, the reserves equals 20% times 500. قديش عندي reserves؟ 100. هذا required reserve كله مظبوط. وفي عندي loans قديش بقدر اعمل؟ 400. خليه بدي اروح على شيء اوضح. هذا حنرجع له هالجيت. لا كله رجع له هذا ان شاء الله. Now suppose that we have the following example. The first charter bank has assets and liabilities. The liabilities, we have deposits, net worth, and the total liabilities. So as you see, the deposit equals how much? 800, right? The net worth equals 400. هدول اللي بيقدر يتصرف، اللي بيقدرش يتصرف فيهم البنك. خلينا نشوف. Let's go to the exercises. Refer to the table. If the required reserve ratio equals 25%, and the required reserve ratio قديش؟ 25%. The first charter, if the first charter bank is meeting its required requirements or reserve requirements and has no excess reserves, فيش عنده excess reserves, its reserves equals how much? هلا suppose انه الديبوزيت equal قديش؟ 800. وعند required reserve ratio قديش؟ 25%. قديش بيكون في عندي reserves؟ Exactly. So the reserves, in this case, the reserves equals deposit times the required reserve ratio. طبعا هذا when excess reserve بيساوي صفر. أنا بقول لي فيش عندي excess reserves، وبالتالي الريزيرفز كله إيش بيساوي؟ بيساوي required reserve. يعني بدي أرجع للسؤال هيك. شو شباب؟ هذا بيقول لنا وإنه إيش؟ إنه if the first charter bank is meeting its reserves requirements and has no excess reserves. لما بيكون في عندي فيش عندي excess reserves، يعني excess reserves equals قديش؟ زيرو. يعني الريزيرفز في هذه الحالة أنا الريزيرفز كله إيش بيساوي؟ لا بدي ارجع لللو تبع للفورمولا. ريزيرفز كله توتال ريزيرفز، هذا لما بحكي في ريزيرف بحكي في توتال ريزيرفز equals الريكوايرد ريزيرفز بلس الاكسس ريزيرفز. انه جزء انا من الريزيرفز هذول جزء منه ريكوايرد وجزء ايش ماله؟ اكسس. هلا هو بقول لي انه if the excess reserves equals zero، معنى الكلام انه التوتال ريزيرفز اللي هو الريزيرفز هذا بيساوي required reserves. صح؟ هي السؤال هيك. So let's come back to the question. هلا معطيني the required reserve ratio is 25%. إذا كان ال excess reserves يساوي صفر، قديش في عندي the question is its reserves قديش؟ اللي هو عمليا reserves هذا قديش بيساوي؟ it equals deposits times required reserve ratio لأنه reserves هو يساوي الإيش؟ required reserves صار في هذه الحالة لأنه هذا صفر صح؟ so it equals $800 times 0.25 قديش هذا بيكون؟ so in this case the reserves equals 200 هلا في الاكسرسايز اللي جاي حتوضح الصورة بشكل أوضح بس لأنه هذا the first example. طب اللونز قديش بيقبض؟ هلا التوتال لازم liabilities equals assets لازم الاسيتس تساوي الايش؟ liabilities وبالتالي التوتال must equal 1200. إذا قديش في عندي لونز بقدر يعطي؟ 1000 صح؟ تمام؟ طيب so the question is how much is the reserve? 200 والtotal assets equals 1000. تمام؟ اللي بعده بقولنا انه its loans equals how much 1000 بعدين اللي هو total assets 1200. طيب let's go to this example. The first commercial bank has the following assets and liabilities, right? The information about the liabilities are given. The total assets equals the total liabilities, right? طيب. As you see, the total reserves equals how much? $800,000 صح؟ قديش في عنا required reserve؟ 200. قديش excess reserve؟ Exactly. متممتها $600,000 صح؟ قديش في عندي loans إذن؟ اللي هو 2 مليون ونص 2.5 مليون minus reserves صح شباب؟ مظبوط ولا لا؟ مين مش فاهم طيب؟ التوتال assets عبارة عن ايش؟ reserves plus loans صح؟ وبالتالي التوتال او اللونز بيساوي 2 مليون ونص ناقص 800,000 قديش بيكون؟ مليون 700,000 1.7 خلاص مليون or that's it. تمام؟ طيب so the question is refer to the table. First commercial bank excess reserves equals قديش؟ تمام؟ و required reserve ratio equals قديش؟ required reserves over deposits صح؟ خلاص so قديش required reserve ratio؟ required reserve ratio equals required reserves over deposits. طبعا مضروب في 100%. So in this case, let's come back to the information. So as you see, the required reserve ratio equals the required reserve اللي هو $200,000 over 2 million. صح؟ So the required reserve ratio in this case equals the required reserves equals $200,000 over 2 million times 100 وبالتالي هذا بيساوي 10%. That's it. تمام؟ اوكي. مين مش فاهم؟ طيب اعيد له. يا شباب حبايبي مين اعيد له؟ اوكي. Okay, the first commercial bank total loans equals قديش؟ How much؟ حسبناها $1,700,000. The last D. The answer is D. Okay, let's go to this example. طبعا هذا جاب الامتحان بالفاينل اكزام المرة الماضية. As you see, we have deposits or the liabilities, deposits, net worth, total liabilities, and we have the excess reserve is missing, is unknown, the loans is unknown. Let's calculate the missing values and the required reserve ratio. As you know, the total liabilities equals $800,000. Deposits $500,000. So how much is the net worth? Exactly. $300,000. The excess reserves equal exactly 200. How much is the loans? Exactly $500,000. Thank you. تمام؟ طيب. So how much is the required reserve ratio? The required reserve ratio equals the required reserve over deposits. قديش؟ 100,000 100,000 over $500. قديش 20%. مظبوط؟ 20%. So the required reserve equals 20%. What else? An excess reserve equals how much?
200.
Exactly 200. It's already calculated. أيها. Loans 500 with net worth 300. These are the questions. طيب. Crescent. هذا another question. Crescent City Bank has 2 million in deposits. So the deposit equals how much? 2 million. So the deposits equals 200 million. Right? Crescent City Bank is meeting its reserve requirement and has no excess reserves. This means إنه excess reserves equals قديش؟ 0. So عند excess reserves equals 0. Or this means إنه reserves كله equals required reserve. شو هيك معناه؟ Because إنه required or total reserves إيش بيساوي؟ Required reserve plus excess reserves. When excess reserve equals 0, so the total reserves or reserves equals the required reserve. صح؟ مظبوط؟ طيب, let's come back to the exercise. It has 40 million in reserves. يعني عندنا required reserves أو reserves قديش؟ 40. So reserves or required reserves equals 40 million. Right? The Central or Crescent City Bank faces a required reserve ratio of قديش؟
20%.
Exactly. مظبوط. So the required reserve ratio equals the required reserves over deposits equals 400 over 200. قديش بيطلع هذا؟ 20%. That's it. صعبة؟ ايه؟ طب مين مش فاهم عيد له؟ اوكي. تمام. طيب, let's go to this example. Narnia National Bank has $750 or $1 million in deposits. So the deposit equals how much? The deposit $750 million. The required reserve ratio equals 30%. So the required reserve ratio equals 30%. The Narnia National Bank must keep how much in reserves?
150 and 30.
يعني قديش required reserves؟ هاي السؤال. يعني قديش لازم يحجزوا عند السنترال بانك. So the required reserve equals RRR times deposit. قديش هذا؟ 0.30 times 750 equals $225 million. This is the required reserve ratio, right? طيب, قديش بيكون عندهم اللي هو الاكسس ريزيرف in this case.
750 minus 200.
Exactly. اللي هو الاكسس ريزيرف in this case ما قاليش انه يساوي صفر equals 0. So the excess reserve equals a total reserve اللي هو هذا كله تمام minus a required reserve. Right? Naim Bank has $300 million in deposit. The required reserve ratio is طبعا the same exactly. طيب Intracoastal Bank has 5 million deposits and 500,000 in reserves. Right? خلينا نشوف نعمل تجزئة للبيانات ونشوف شو الحاجة. So the question is, suppose in the deposits equals how much?
5 million.
Exactly. Deposits equals $500,000. Right? طيب. Sorry, 5 million. 5 million. Exactly. 5 million.
The total reserve is 500.
And 500,000 in reserves. Reserves or total reserves 500,000. Right? طيب. If the required reserve ratio equals 5%, so RRR equals 5%. قديش الاكسس ريزيرف؟ اكسس ريزيرف لازم نجيب الريكوايرد ريزيرف بعدين نخصمها. مظبوط؟ صح؟ مظبوط ولا لا؟ So required reserve equals ال RRR times deposits. The required reserves equals 5%, 5% times reserves, deposits 5 million. قديش هذا؟ 250,000. هذا ايش؟ This is the required reserve. طب قديش الاكسس reserve? How much is the excess reserve? Exactly. Total reserves minus the required reserves. So the excess reserve equals the total reserves or reserves minus the required reserves. صح? So equals $500,000 minus $250,000 equals $250,000. That's it. صعب الأمور؟ طيب. Let's go to another question. The Bank of Asia has the same, I think. Deposits 980,000 reserves. وعندنا 9 deposits 9 million في deposits. where a required reserve ratio is 10%. قديش excess reserve? The same. تمام؟ Okay. The Bank of Red Oak has 2 million in deposits and 400,000 in reserves. Right? If the excess reserve equals $800,000, how much is the required reserve ratio? خلينا نجزء البيانات. So, as you see, the deposits equals how much? How much is in deposits? 2 million. Right? And
400.
the total reserves 400,000. Right? And if the excess reserves equals 100,000. How much is the required reserve ratio? We have to calculate the required reserve and then the required reserve ratio. صح؟ required reserve ايش بيساوي؟ total reserves or reserves minus excess reserves. equals total reserves. لما بقول لي reserves على طول بعرف بفهم انه بيحكي عن total reserves. تمام. so reserves عندي قديش؟ $400,000 minus excess reserves 100,000. $300,000. So how much is the required reserve ratio, Abu Jazar?
Required reserve over deposit.
So the required reserve ratio equals required reserves over deposits equals 300,000 over $2 million equals how much? Exactly 15%. Right? صعب الأمور. Let's go to this example. As you see, everything is given here. So شو المطلوب? So as you see, the total reserves equals 1.2 million. The loans equals 6.8. The total 8 million, right? The liabilities, deposits equals 8 million, right? And the total equals 8 million, right? Let's go. Sorry. Okay, let's go to the exercise of the requirements. If the required reserve ratio equals or is 15%, the first charter bank is what? يعني لو suppose إنه required reserves عندي ratio بيساوي 15%. قديش عندي required reserves في هذه الحالة in this case عشان نشوف شو وضع البنك. So as you see إنه required reserve ratio equals 15%. Required reserve ratio equals 15%, right? ومعطيني reserves بيساوي 1.2. طب قديش required reserve؟ هذا السؤال عشان أشوف شو وضع البنك. How much is the required reserve? Required reserve ratio times deposits. صح؟ Equals قديش 15% times deposits 8 million equals how much? 1.2 million dollars. معنى الكلام ايش؟ انه required reserve ratio او sorry required reserve بتساوي ايش؟ reserves. وبالتالي excess reserve ايش ماله يساوي؟ if the excess reserve بيساوي صفر equals 0, in this case the bank is loaned up لانه فيش عنده مصاري قرض. هي معنى الكلام. لانه معطي كله حاطه عند مين؟ عند السنترال بانك. هي معنى الكلام شباب. if the excess reserve هي ارجع لهنا هيك. As you see that the required reserve equals how much? بعد الحسابات 1.2 صح؟ والreserves كله reserves equals 1.2. This means انه required reserves كله equals اللي هو required reserves زائد excess reserves صح؟ قديش reserves كله 1.2 equals required reserves 1.2 plus 0. معنى الكلام انه excess reserves equal قديش 0. معوش مصاري قرض. هاي باختصار. So in this case the bank is loaned up. When the excess reserve equals 0, in this case the bank is called is loaned up. يعني فيش عنده إشي يقرضه. تمام؟ تمام. طيب let's go to this واضحة الصورة ولا مش واضحة؟ طيب refer to the table اللي معطينا إياه هذا. If the required reserve ratio were changed to 5%. يعني required reserve ratio بطل 15% became 5%, and the first charter bank continued to hold 1.2 million or $1,200,000 in reserves. Its excess reserve will be قديش? This is the question. So in this case required reserve ratio قديش? 5%. where hold قديش عندي في reserves 1.2 million. يعني في reserves عندي 1,200,000 The question is, excess reserve equals how much? This is the question. So we have to calculate the required reserve صح and then the excess reserve صح. So the required reserve equals 5%
times
0.5 times deposits the same. قديش صار عندي required reserve؟
400
sorry
400
400,000 متأكدين؟
yes.
تمام. Okay. So the required reserves or the excess reserves
1.2
equals the total reserves or reserves minus the required reserves. So the total reserves equals how much قديش؟ 1,200,000 minus the required reserve. So the excess reserve
equals
$800,000. Right? صعبة؟ طيب. Let's go to this example. As you see, the new deposits, the required reserves and loans. Suppose in the bank number 1, someone deposits $100,000. واحد معاه $100,000 وحطهم في البنك A. تمام؟ required reserve قديش؟ 5000. إذا قديش required reserve ratio؟ 5%. تمام؟ راح البنك معطي لونز بقديش؟ ب 95,000. تمام؟ صح؟ راحوا اللي أخذ اللون هذا حطوا في بنك تاني the second bank 95% as a deposit in the second bank. The second bank عمل deduction ب 5% بالريزيرفز هذا صار عنده قديش required reserve هالقد وصار معطي لونز هالقد. الشخص الثاني the second person شو عمل؟ أخذ هذا المبلغ as a loan وراح حطهم في بنك ثالث هيهم as a deposit. The third bank ايش عمل؟ عمل deduction ب 5% صار قديش 5% من هذا المبلغ هيهم هالقد وبالتالي بيعمل لون هالقد and so on. تمام؟ طيب السؤال بيقولنا let's go to the refer to the scenario. What is the required reserve ratio؟ لو required reserves over deposits صح؟ طيب what is the money multiplier in this economy؟ let's come back to the money multiplier. هلا الصورة واضحة بالنسبة لكم صارت شباب؟ ايه؟ بموضوع ال required reserve ratio وال required reserve excess reserves